Hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you are. And welcome to the joint EAAFP and CMS ITTEA virtual workshop on the legal take of migratory birds. I am Susan Sang. I'm the coordinator of the ITTEA, and I'm moderating today's workshop. This is the first of two sessions. Today, we'll focus on broadly understanding the importance of surveys on wildlife and food markets and netting, and a few examples to provide some base context for us on the topic. And then we'll move on to presentations from experts to have a little bit of a discussion about past experiences and gaps in knowledge and things like that. The next session, which is on Monday, will be the one which focuses more on the technical aspects, but today we're really setting a foundation for all of us to make sure we're all on the same page. Please be advised, this meeting is being recorded and it will be available later on the CMS YouTube page. So if you have colleagues that could not make it today, then you can direct them to that. I will send out links to also the website where we'll put the resources that we'll talk about during this particular workshop. And if you have any questions during the workshop, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute your mic to speak. Or if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can type it in the chat and I can say it for you. I would like to now please welcome Dr. Mark Carey to make some opening remarks as the Vice Chair of the EAAFP Task Force on Illegal Hunting, Taking, and Trade of Migratory Waterbirds, and also subbing in as Chair for the ITTEA in place of Ms. Narelle Montgomery as the representative from Australia. Mark?
Thanks, Susan. I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome and thank everyone for attending today's workshop. I'm looking forward to participating in today's session and again next week at the second workshop. My name is Mark Carey from the Australian Government, Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. Earlier this year, Australia co-hosted the 11th meeting of partners of the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership in Brisbane. During the meeting, Australia was pleased to participate in the first joint meeting of the CMS Intergovernmental Task Force to address illegal hunting, take and trade of migratory birds in the EAAFP, and the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnership's Task Force on Illegal Hunting, Taking and Trade of Migratory Water Birds. These two task forces are working together to understand and find solutions to address the threat of illegal hunting, take and trade of migratory birds in our flyway. In Brisbane, we learned that the illegal take of migratory birds is widespread in our flyway and it is impacting a large number of species, including migratory land birds, shorebirds and seabirds. Some of these species are threatened with extinction. In Brisbane, one of the key outcomes was the development of a joint program of work that will help guide our work over the coming months and years. And Australia was pleased to be elected as chair of the CMS Intergovernmental Task Force. Today's workshop is the first step in implementing the joint program of work to further understand the issue of illegal take of migratory birds. Once we understand the issue, we can work together to find solutions. So I encourage all participants today to use their knowledge and skills to help address the issue of illegal take. Over the coming months, I hope we can build on the achievements and outcomes from today's workshop to further address the issues affecting our migratory birds. I look forward to hearing from you all on how the task forces can help support the conservation of our shared migratory birds. Thank you, Susan. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And now I will invite Mr. Tilman Schneider from the CMS Secretariat to say a few words about the CMS, since I know this is not a region that's as familiar with the CMS, and he'll speak to some of the mandates and initiatives that we have related to take in this region. Tilman?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Susan and Mark, for the nice introduction. And welcome and thanks to all of you joining this important workshop today. I will shortly start with a small presentation. My name is Tilman Schneider. I'm from the avian species team, Associate Program Officer at the CMS Secretariat. I will now share my screen to give you an overview of the task force on illegal hunting, taking, and trade of migratory birds in the East Asian Australasian Flyway. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes,
Not
you
yet.
just need to go to
Now?
full screen.
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry.
But it needs to be in a present. Yeah, good.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah, I said CMS Secretariat is facilitating the task force on illegal hunting, taking, and trade of migratory birds in the East Asian Australasian Flyway, the ITTEA, under a joint approach with the East Asian Australasian Flyway Partnerships Task Force on illegal hunting, taking, and trade of migratory water birds. This initiative has been recently established. Susan Zhang is the coordinator of this initiative, this was made possible through voluntary contributions from the government of Australia. Maybe not all of you are completely familiar with CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species. Just to give you a brief introduction, CMS is a multilateral environmental agreement of the United Nations. The history goes back into basically the establishment of the United Nations Environment Programme at the Stockholm 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment, where already the special threats faced by migratory species were recognized, and the need for an international agreement was also recognized. CMS was then signed in Bonn in 1979. That's why it's also called the Bonn Convention, and entered into force in 1983. Now CMS has 133 parties, including 132 countries plus the European Union, and it is the only global treaty to focus on the conservation of migratory species and their habitats. First of all, to say the CMS definition of migratory species is rather a juridical one rather than a biological one. Migratory species in terms of CMS means species or lower taxa of which a significant proportion cyclically and predictably cross one or more national jurisdictional boundaries. And the core mandate of CMS are its appendices. Appendix 1 lists endangered species which are in danger of extinction in all or most of their range. They are, and the parties to the convention have committed to conserve and restore the habitat, and only with a few exceptions, no taking of these species is permitted. And then Appendix 2 lists species which are also in an unfavorable conservation status and require international agreements for their conservation and would significantly benefit from international cooperation. CMS is a framework convention, and under CMS there are a wide variety of daughter agreements, which are legally binding ones on the one hand, for example, related to birds, African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, IUA, and then non-legally binding instruments, which you can see on the right side. For example, a significant one is the one on the Memorandum of Understanding on the conservation of migratory birds of prey in the African Eurasian region, the Raptors MOU. But also you see that under CMS, many other species apart from birds, including terrestrial mammals, aquatic species, aquatic fish, aquatic mammals, etc., are protected. Related to birds and flyways, CMS has a number of specific mandates and initiatives established by the Conference of the Parties to CMS. First of all, the topic we are talking about today, the prevention of illegal taking and trade. At the moment, we have two specific task forces: the task force on addressing illegal taking in the Mediterranean region, the MICT, and the ITTEA. The most recently established one focusing on the illegal taking and trade in the African and in the East Asian Australasian flyway. Yeah, this many of these initiatives are under the umbrella of a global flyways program of work, and specific work and resolutions of CMS focus on preventing poisoning of migratory birds, reconciling renewable energy developments with conservation of migratory species. For example, the multi-stakeholder platform, the Energy Task Force. And then there are specific other tools and instruments, for example, regional action plans, the action plan for migratory land birds in the African Eurasian region, and single and multi-species action plans. For example, for an action plan for the Far Eastern curlew, and an action plan for multiple species of vultures in the African Eurasian region. Other specific initiatives focuses on conservation issues and threats. For example, the Scientific Task Force on Avian Influenza and Wild Birds, and also work of CMS addresses climate change, ecological connectivity, pollution, and several other topics. Specifically for this region in the East Asian Australasian flyway, there are some important species also listed on the CMS Appendix 1 and 2. For example, the Far Eastern curlew, for which an international single species action plan has been adopted under CMS. And currently 2 projects are under implementation. The evaluation of the impact of shorebird hunting in the Russian Far East, and another project on exploratory surveys to clarify the status of the endangered Far Eastern curlew on the Sarawak coastline in Borneo and Malaysia. And these are projects based on small-scale funding agreements, which were made possible thanks to voluntary contributions from the government of Australia. Another priority species is the yellow-breasted bunting, for which a multi-species, a single species action plan, has been developed, and which is currently under endorsement, in the process of endorsement under CMS. This species covered a large range in earlier times, about almost 60 million square kilometers, and was actually inhabiting the region by hundreds of millions of individuals. However, there was a drastic decline in this species population since 1980 until today. And the main threat identified has been the unsustainable harvest, which led to almost the extinction of the species in large parts of the range. The species is listed on CMS Appendix 1 as well, and critically endangered, or ranked as critically endangered on IUCN since 2017. And coming more specifically to the CMS mandates related to illegal taking of birds, this is mainly the resolution 1116 Rev Cop 13, through which the Conference of the Parties decided to establish the Intergovernmental Task Force on Illegal Hunting, Taking and Trade of Migratory Birds in the EAAFP, the so-called ITTEA, based on the adoption of terms of reference for the task force annexed to this resolution. And based on this, the CMS Secretariat has facilitated the establishment of this important platform. And the first meeting of the task force was actually held this year in Brisbane, in the margins of the EAAFP meeting of partners in March this year, as said. And this initiative is currently funded also by Australia. The chair is Marianne Montgomery from Australia, the vice chair. You have our delegate from Bangladesh now, and the main outcome of the first meeting, which was held jointly actually together with the task force of the EAAFP on illegal taking. The main outcome was the endorsement of a program of work, and the main elements of this program of work for the next couple of years will be to understand the scope, scale, and motivations for illegal take of migratory birds in the region. Then also to understand and develop effective national legislative frameworks and guidance to fill in gaps. Establish in situ prevention, including increasing public awareness and education on illegal take of migratory birds. And last but not least, also to establish a sustainable funding for these activities. And we think this was is a major step forward also in that the countries, not only CMS parties, but many other range states have endorsed this program of work and also take ownership of its goals and the activities contained. One of the main actions and first actions in implementing this is a workshop today, which I think is a really important and interesting one and topic-wise. And very much looking forward to a good conversation with all of you. And if you have any questions, of course, related to general aspects of CMS, please feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you, and back to you, Susan.
Okay, thank you, Tilman. I am also now going to get to the meat of what we're doing. And I'm getting some recording requests from people, and I'm going to deny them only to mention to you that this is recorded again, and it will be posted on the CMS YouTube. So please just bear with me on that. Okay, so Ding Li, Mr. Ding Li Yong, who is from BirdLife International, will now start setting the stage for us about what market surveys are and how they're useful and important to the study of illegal take in this region, and hopefully useful for those who are working on policy and enforcement. Ding Li?
Thanks. Thank you, Susan, for introducing me, and it's my pleasure on behalf of BirdLife International to be here to share a little bit about our work that we undertook on trying to understand the state of bird hunting in Southeast Asia over that period just before the pandemic started. I have a very short presentation, mostly to give the context for Southeast Asia, but also to share a little bit of our on-ground experiences in conducting these market surveys. And I have a very short presentation about some of the work that we've done in 4 Southeast Asian countries. Most of the material that I will be presenting has already been published in a manuscript just a year ago, and the rest of it should be expected to come out close to the end of this year, if not next. So without any delay, I'm just going to hit the share screen, and you should be able to see this presentation shortly. Could you see the maps on your screens?
Yeah, you just need to full screen right now.
Okay. Okay, there's a bit of time lag there. Yep, but some familiar pictures here. So once again, as I've mentioned, I am here to give you a bit of context and background on bird hunting in the wider backdrop of wildlife trade and wildlife hunting in Southeast Asia. I also want to justify why we have chosen to focus on Southeast Asia. Why is this such an important region for us? Many of us here on this call are conservationists, and I think we are all aware that this is a really rich region for biodiversity. Many species reach their peak of species richness here in 4 biodiversity hotspots, and many of us on this call come from the countries within these 4 biodiversity hotspots, which explains why we are here today and why these surveys that we have done have focused on these regions underlined in my slide. Hunting is obviously a very grave threat to biodiversity in Southeast Asia, especially to large body vertebrates. I think there's a large literature of hunting on mammals, from everything from primates to some of these large ungulate species. Much of this has been very well documented in lots of studies that have been carried out in the last 10, 20 years. There's also a lot of work that is showing that a lot of hunting in the region targets specific high-value species, some of these species which are birds and mammals that we know much about. Broadly speaking, a lot of conservationists working in the region considered wildlife hunting in Southeast Asia to be very unsustainable, partly because many vertebrate populations have declined greatly, and so Without any further limitations or enforcement, many of these species will be pushed into further declines and possibly even local extinction. In our region, there's been a lot of work also done in the past decade or so to look at international trade. I think there's an awesome amount of work that has been done to look into the songbird trade and into the parrot trade, going between different countries in the region, noting also that Southeast Asia is one of the global hotspots for bird trade. I think one of the gaps that many conservationists have recognized, increasingly so in recent years, is the gap of local trade. And there's a increasing realization that there's a lot of hunting at scale going on within provinces, within villages, and at smaller scale jurisdiction. So as much as we know a lot about trade or wildlife happening at the international and regional scale, there are some really clear gaps in knowledge in relation to our knowledge of bird hunting at the local scale. In Southeast Asia, bird hunting has been documented anecdotally for a long time. But those of us who work in the region and visiting markets here and there across Southeast Asia, especially in the mainland Southeast Asian countries, we know that there are waterbirds that are constantly being offered on sale in markets. It could be in food markets, or it could be more focused on wildlife targeted markets. There's also some levels of documentation of trapping of small spotted species like swallows, wagtails, and buntings in different parts of the region for the food trade, and also to some extent for the trade in birds for religious releases. So the problem is not totally unknown. We know bits and pieces from what has been documented out there in the last 20, 30 years. Unfortunately, we also recognize that there is not that much work on systematic surveys and surveys that has been undertaken at specific times of the year to understand what is the extent and scale of this problem. And so this is where BirdLife came in response to a resolution that was passed in Manila at the CMS Convention of Parties in Manila to undertake a situation analysis within the context of the East Asian Australasian flyway to better understand this problem and to see how we can find policy and enforcement solutions for this. So my presentation today will provide you a little bit of focus into one component of our work. There's different bits of work that we've done also looking into policy, into missed-net surveys, and a few other things, but missed-net surveys will be covered by my colleague later on in this workshop, and also in the next session. So for focus, I will talk a little bit more about our work on market surveys and some of the new things we have learned from them, as well as some of the challenges that we face when undertaking these surveys. To give a little bit of background, a lot of this work actually came about from a workshop that BirdLife International organized in Southeast Asia more than 4 years ago, 1 year after the CMS COP. And in response to the resolution that was passed that I mentioned earlier on, we convened a workshop to basically mobilize teams in different Southeast Asian countries to undertake work to assess the scale, to put together all the available information, and so as to present a regional outlook on the state of bird hunting in this part of the world. So some of us on this call here, you might well see your own picture here taken from that fateful workshop in Bangkok, Thailand in 2019. A lot of the work that you will soon see in this workshop, and possibly even the next workshop, started from conversations that happened in this workshop in 2019. For market surveys, we have decided to focus our energies and efforts on 4 countries where birds are often sold in markets, and these countries are Laos, Cambodia, Burma, and Vietnam. And through the work of 4 partners that we were able to collaborate with through this workshop, we were able to undertake a lot of the market surveys that was done later on in the year in 2019. So the work in Laos was led by our colleagues at the Wildlife Conservation Society. In Cambodia, it was led by Nature Life Cambodia. In Burma, it was led by the Biodiversity and Nature Conservation Association. And lastly, for Vietnam, we had work that was driven by Viet Nature in the northern parts and the northern provinces of Vietnam. Broadly speaking, our geographic scope was focused on Indo-Burma. After all, Indo-Burma is not just a species-rich region, it's also a region that has a lot of different conservation challenges. The focus of our work was not to get the best data possible, but to offer a snapshot on species diversity, what are the species that are being traded, and also to get a sense of the relative abundance of the different species that are being hunted and traded in markets, which means that a lot of our work is focused on very short scale surveys. Many markets were visited only once or twice over the span of 3 to 4 months. And in our survey, we typically would deploy up to 2 persons to undertake the market checks. Often these had to be done in a very discreet way, and also in collaboration with someone in the team who has a good knowledge of local languages, so that we can talk to vendors and get input from them. There were several considerations that we thought out when we were organizing these market surveys. We know that because of time limitations, resource limitations, we had to do it in a very snapshot way. So obviously, it is really difficult for us to say what is the state of turnover, how many birds were sold per day, per season, or per year. But of course, this means that there's also scope for us to undertake future surveys to answer some of these questions. We've also considered the fact that as much as we assume that many markets will have wildlife being sold, there would also be many markets whereby enforcement sweeps have been carried out, and so wildlife may no longer be sold or are sold in a more clandestine manner. Other considerations were more logistical and on-the-ground focus. For example, we were also concerned about getting responses from the people who were selling stuff, so from the sellers who may not necessarily be cooperative or willing to share information, for example. And of course, we also recognize the fact that in many cases, we will not be able to survey or sample whatever that is being put on the shelves or on those tables in the markets. So my next few slides will give you a sampling of 3 markets and the state of birds that are sold in these 3 markets. First, in this set of 3 markets, we have one market in Sian Kuang province in Lao PDR. This market has been well documented actually. It's known to a lot of my Laotian colleagues, and it was definitely highlighted to be a hotspot for us to undertake more thorough surveys. These are some of the photographs that were documented on site by our colleagues over the period 2019 to 2020. You can see some of the challenges that we face in doing these bird surveys are very real and in your face, because a lot of the birds were prepared and we were not always able to identify the species, which means that we couldn't also determine the relative abundances easily. In northern Laos, I think there's some understanding and knowledge of local consumption and also the fact that some of these species are highly sought after as local delicacies. So just a little bit of a snapshot of some of the scenes that we see in this particular market in Sian Kuang province, where many birds that were being sold were being processed and defeathered, so making things really hard for us to identify. Then we have another market that we surveyed in Cambodia. This is in Kampong Cham province. It's another well-known market, but mostly to local people. This is a roadside market consisting of not more than 10 to 12 vendors, and this market sells a variety of wild birds, some of which are cooked, like the ones that you see in the middle. Some of these wild birds are freshly caught and defeathered, as you can see on the left. And then finally, we also have a couple of these shops selling live birds that has been immobilized for sale. And then we have another market that we've sampled in Burma. In Myanmar, we have markets that sell a mix of birds for food. As you can see on the left, some of these birds are still alive, as what you have seen in Vietnam. Some of these are already dead, and of course, these markets also sell large amounts of live birds that are targeted at people who want to procure them for religious releases. In summary, a few key findings. We find that certain groups of birds, certain taxonomic groups of birds were disproportionately more represented than other groups. For example, shorebirds were very clear in certain markets in Vietnam. Rails and other sorts of paddy field dwelling water birds were apparent in the surveys that we have done in Cambodia, as are herons and bitterns in different parts of Cambodia and Laos as well. But in the mountainous inland regions of Laos, we find that in some of these markets, water birds are less represented, but instead they are replaced by large numbers of forest-dwelling passerines and some migratory species such as barn swallows. So broadly speaking, our work also reviewed the extent and scale of the problem, as some of us have assumed it at the beginning of this study. At the start, we had not a very clear idea, but we feel that after these surveys are done, that we think that the problem is far more grave than we have formerly assumed. There are many markets across the region selling wild birds, including migratory species at scale. As I mentioned early on, for those of you who want to know a little bit more about the work, you can dig into this paper, which was put together by the team, including 4 or 5 different NGOs and universities in the region, which also has all the data from the surveys that are now being published, published in the appendices and some of the attached information. Some of the lessons that we have learned, I think this is probably useful for those of us in this call who are keen to undertake some of these market surveys for monitoring. There were 5 or 6 key things that we've learned from our experiences. Number 1, I think we felt that it was really hard to determine turnover. And so much of the work, much of the data that we were able to churn out from our surveys would, I would say, be considered as snapshot, although there would be also considerable challenges doing turnover surveys because often vendors get a bit suspicious when they see surveyors coming back again day after day to see what's on sale. And sometimes some of these sold stuff would be withdrawn from display. The other challenge we faced was also with respect to identification. A lot of the birds that were being sold were already cooked or defeathered. So oftentimes we had to assume what species that were being sold based on the bare parts of the birds that we can observe. But fortunately, it seems to me that our colleagues in Cambodia has already preempted this problem a long time ago. And there's one little resource document that was published, I think, about 20 years ago by Wildlife Conservation Society on market surveys in Cambodia. So this turned out to be a really useful resource for us, but of course this is more relevant for Cambodia and doesn't cover the full breadth of species in mainland Southeast Asia. We also found that there were many markets that had no wildlife at all. Whether it was because they were hidden, we will never know. But more than half of the markets we visited do not explicitly put wildlife on display in the vendors. But for those that sell wildlife, most of these vendors do not necessarily sell purely wildlife products or dead or live wildlife. Many of these are vendors that were selling seafood products, fish, for example, vegetables, and selling a few birds here and there in accompaniment with whatever else they were selling. And of course, we learned very well that whatever we see may not represent the full scale of the problem because many vendors do not show what is being sold because they are aware that in many instances sale of wildlife is illegal. We have actually more than 2 experiences where we explicitly saw vendors deliberately hiding wildlife when we were approaching the scene. So I think it doesn't help that we are wearing NGO t-shirts on some occasions, so it was quite obvious. So what have we done as a matter of follow-up so far? We have in fact followed up on many of these findings through direct feedback with our collaborating governments. A lot of these have been conveyed to them in close meetings and workshops. So that information has definitely gone out to policymakers in many different ways. Many of these workshops which were organized in the midst of the pandemic. And as I mentioned earlier on, the rest of the updates from my presentation will come out in a more comprehensive situation analysis, which is due for release at the CMS COP in 2024 in Uzbekistan. I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. And once again, I thank my collaborators in Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Cambodia for their hard work in the field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ding Li. Are there any questions from anybody in the audience about anything that he's spoken about? Please feel free to raise your hand and unmute or type it in the chat if you have any questions. I also just want to pose in general to everybody, in hearing all of this from Ding Li, think about if you've conducted any of these types of surveys before, or like if you are in a policy position or in an NGO, if you've used these kinds of survey data before to help make decisions or direct where your priorities are, I think that kind of mindset to walk into this and think about everything he spoke about today will be helpful for also setting us up for next week for those who are new to this and learning how to do it. So just remember, this is just contextualizing everything. And if nobody has any questions, I guess we could move on to the next one. Feel free to always just raise your hand, ask a question anytime, or you can save it for next week when we get into even more technical stuff. Maybe I'll help answer some of the questions you have in mind. With that, it's something that Ding Li alluded to are netting surveys. And so, not everybody has a market around them, right? And there are a lot of places that have human modified landscapes in this region that have likely unsustainable take, but our understanding of that is also rather limited. So we need to do net surveys. So as an example of this, we have invited Ms. Rongrong Ankiao from King Mongkut University of Technology in Thonburi to give a presentation on an example of a study that she has done on this. And Rongrong, if you could please share your screen and please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, perfectly clearly.
Okay.
You just need to share your screen for the presentation now. There you go.
Okay. Can you see it right now?
Yes, we are good.
Okay, so good afternoon from Thailand again, everyone. I am Rongrong, or Phi, you can call me Phi. I am a PhD candidate from Conservation Ecology Program, and it is my pleasure to be here today. And before I begin, I would like to thank Stingley and Susan for this opportunity for me to share my work in this workshop. So the presentation that I'm going to share with you guys is about the impacts of nets that are mainly used to protect the agricultural and aquacultural product in central Thailand. And I hope that the different contexts in Thailand would provide you with some interesting insights. So first of all, I would just like to inform you that this presentation is only a small chapters of my dissertation, which focuses on the conservation of farmland and grassland birds in central Thailand. And this project investigates the habitat-specific density of the open country landbird species and their threats, including netting. And then I will use those data to identify the key management option that could be done in this landscape in Thailand. So as everyone knows, birds provide many different ecological services beneficial to farmers. For example, pest control, seed dispersal, or pollination. However, many species are considered pests, and pest bird management can be very challenging and costly to farmers. And in Thailand and Southeast Asia, various methods, including nets, are used across a wide variety of the agricultural landscapes, and it's typically result in the death of entangled birds. So these problems of nets that used to protect the crops and fish is really widespread in most Southeast Asia, as Tingley mentioned. We are facing the similar threats, but netting impact on the bird mortality remain mostly unquantified, particularly in the agricultural landscape, such as the rice fields area. So to come up with more ecologically friendly management plans, more data is needed. And therefore, in this study, we aim to assess the scale of the net used and identify the bird species impacted by nets and other preventive measures. And let me introduce you a little bit more about the Central Plains of Thailand. It is a large expanse of low-lying open country habitats covering an area of approximately 51,600 square kilometers, and the lower parts of the area is recognized as an IBA, or the Important Bird and Biodiversity Area by BirdLife International. And here are the pictures that I think can give you some ideas. So various types of the open country habitats can be found in my study area, including rice fields, aquacultural area, natural grassland, and reed beds. And here are the map shows the different land use types. So there are 3 major habitat types classified in this study. The green color represents rice fields area, blue aquaculture pond, and gray is the other habitat types, such as the human settlements, plantation, orchard, and sugarcane fields. So as you can see, the whole area dominated by rice fields, with the aquaculture ponds often mixed, especially at the lower parts of the plains. And the big gray patch here is the highly urbanized Bangkok area, which is the capital city of Thailand. And this map showing the starting point of each transect that were randomly located at 2 kilometers apart from each other throughout my study area. So in total, we conducted the net survey from 1,312 transects. As I mentioned earlier, actually this point were randomly located for my bird survey. So after I finish the bird survey, I do the net data collection. We collect the data on nets and other potentially harmful deterrents observed along 2-kilometer transects, 200 meter width on each side of the road. So whenever we encounter a net, we recorded the type, whether they are, and the bird species, numbers of individual birds trapped in the nets were also recorded. And here is the examples of the nets and other potentially harmful deterrents recorded in this study. So we actually grouped them into just only big 4 types. The first one is the net that were set vertically. We group them as the vertical net. The next one is the parallel cords. So in this study, it's referred to the horizontal parallel cords, which usually suspended above the over entire aquaculture ponds. And the next one is the net exclosure. And the last one is the other types, including hooks attached at the poles or the snares that we observe along the transects. So for the result, based on our survey from only 6-month period, we found 1,881 nets on 196 survey transect. And if you look at the map here, which the data represented in the grid levels, the nets were significantly clustered and more observed at the lower parts of the plains, which is related to the bar chart here, that we found that the numbers of the observed net were significantly different from the expected value based on the habitat area. So the observed numbers of the nets in aquaculture ponds were 13 times higher than the expected value based on the proportion of the area. And in this figure on the left-hand side, show the numbers of the entangled bird and the species that found throughout the study. So in total, we found that more than 80% were not considered highly destructive by farmers, and most of them were trapped in the vertical netting, which represented in the red bar chart. And here are some observations recorded during the study. As you can see, the globally threatened black-capped kingfisher also get caught in the net, and many of them were bycatch species, which provides ecological services in controlling pest insects, rodents, and snails for farmers. And for example, this wrinkled lip bat feed primarily on the major rice pest, the white back panhopper, also get caught in the net. This bat was estimated to prevent the rice loss of almost like 2,900 tons per year. And so for the conclusion, our study showed that the netting is indiscriminately used in Thailand, despite the fact that it is not an effective method in terms of pest control. And this has resulted in the death of many birds and other wildlife, including those that are not considered pests and thought to play an important role in the pest control. And so for the next step in Thailand, I think we need to present this data to the government to propose the restriction on the use of mist nets and find a more compromised way to solve this problem with both rice farmers and aquaculture farmers. And we also think that the community participation should be prioritized in terms of the conservation action in the long term. And if you are interested in the details of this study, it is now available online as an open access. And a part of my study that I collected the data in the field, I have also created an online citizen science project on the iNaturalist application to gather more data elsewhere. So you can just scan the QR code here or search for the Tangle and Trap It project. So far we have got over 1,000 observations worldwide. And here is an interesting stat. So birds is the majority of the group that were submitted to the project. And most of the observations were from the vertical nets. So I think it is the good alternative way to help us to collect more data. And I would greatly appreciate if you could contribute the data to this project. And lastly, I am grateful to my advisor and my colleague here to help me with this project. And thank you for your attention. So any comments, suggestions, or questions are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vi. Very comprehensive, very thorough coverage of nets. And we will, again, to everybody, we will discuss this more about the technical side next week. We'll also have another expert who has also done net studies in China, who will speak to that as well. Are there any questions from anybody in the audience about anything that Roland talked about, what I talked about just now? Nobody, let's see. I just want to quickly read a question in the chat that was to Ding Li for earlier though. So Vicky says, I was just wondering roughly what proportion of vendors were only selling wild birds, wildlife versus vendors selling other things like that. I guess this has been bearing on livelihood implications of efforts to reduce trade in wild birds.
Shall I jump in, Susan?
Yes, please.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I think it often depends on where exactly these markets are. Generally, vendors that were selling wildlife products form the minority of these vendors you will find in any typical market. And one market that I did spend a lot of time in, I think I spent 2 days. I was actually the one serving that market with the WCS team in central Laos. This market had quite a bit of wildlife, but still, I would say vendors formed less than 10%. I think less than 10% of the vendors in this market, which had easily 70 to 80 vendors were selling wildlife. Of course, we focus on the on birds, and approximately half of those stores that were selling wildlife had birds. The rest were selling a lot of other sorts of things. There were mammals. Often there were small mammals, which we were also collecting data on. So well, since we were there, if we saw bats and weasels and squirrels, we just took everything. There were other kinds of wildlife that was difficult to survey in Laos. For example, there were a lot of shops that sold paddy field wildlife that were trawled out of of the rice fields. There were a mishmash of fish and frogs and bugs all mixed together. So those we often had no capacity to figure out what exactly they were, and it was time sensitive because people were coming through quickly. We had to get it surveyed before these things were purchased. So the window was often very narrow. I think often these surveys was carried out within a window of just one hour. So 1 hour, just when the markets open, check them thoroughly. It's also possible that some of these wildlife were missed because they were not exhibited when we passed through. So as always, what we will be seeing is merely a subset of what is on sale. Yeah. But there were some markets that were exceptional. There were certain markets in northern Laos that sold that had a large proportion of vendors selling birds. So the one that you saw on my slide just now, I think that one was prominent because many stores sold birds, and in this part of Laos, it's a known tradition for local people to consume swallows. So many stores, I think we found probably up to 20 vendors that sold barn swallows alone. Some were in small amounts and some were in pots of several hundred. So yeah, it depends on the markets. But generally, it would be less than 10% of what vendors made up those markets.
Yeah, I would also add that for places like Indonesia, there are certain markets that are known to sell things like songbirds, where people go purposely to purchase those. And so in those situations, you would find more vendors selling specifically wild birds. Whereas there are some other markets in Indonesia where, like in Bali, for instance, in Denpasar, you would find the vendors that sell only wildlife kind of in the back of the market, and the front of the market just sells all the regular meats and wildlife and other goods. So it kind of is a mix depending on what kind of market you go to. On the extreme end of selling only wildlife, though, for instance, in Indonesia, in Sulawesi, in Manado, there's a lot of markets there that sell specifically wild meats of bats, primates, snakes, feral animals. And so in those cases, you rarely see anything that is more of the domesticated farm animals sold next to these wildlife. And so that kind of depends on what kind of market you target. And in order to find some of those markets, when we went there, we would have to speak to people and ask them like, hey, when is this available? Where is this available? And some of those wildlife markets are not even open every single day. They're open maybe 1 or 2 times a week. And so you have to get there at the right time as well. So if you have a very short window for surveying, you might miss that. And you might not capture the full extent of what is actually being hunted in that area, not just of birds, but of any other species.
Yeah. I think we had a very similar kind of experience. There were some markets that we plan to cover. Often, for example, in Indochina, we will cover the main provincial market. But along the way, we will work on it in a rather snowbally way. So we'll ask local people, and sometimes they will direct you to a smaller town market that we may not have monitored or are aware of. Yeah. So yeah, that was our experience.
Yeah, and of course, like Ding Li also mentioned, with some of the animals, they're not shown up front, especially animals that are of higher value in some cases, where you have to kind of know the guy and ask the guy for it specifically, and then he'll give it to you. So, for instance, I've gone to many places in Indonesia where I was just wearing jeans. I wasn't wearing like field clothes like Ding Li was mentioning. So they just assumed I was a Chinese tourist. And so they offered actually to sell me songbirds. And it was always one of those things. I'm like, yeah, I'm definitely looking for that, just not for the reason that they think I am. And so there are places where they will purposely actually obfuscate like kind of what kinds of species they have and how many they have and how much they cost as well. There is an example even in Sumatra where the wildlife market is very close to the WCS office that is in that particular city. And so you cannot find anybody in that market who will openly talk to you about selling wildlife, because they know WCS staff go there very often. And they instead will insist that if you are looking for something, they'll kind of send you to a guy who knows a guy and you go to his house, and which is, very shady. And obviously something is illegal in that sense. So there are different ways that people have sold them. And that's not only to speak of the online markets as well, which I know some of our other colleagues at various NGOs are working on trying to monitor those. They're on Facebook, they're on eBay now. They're also sold in some cases overseas to people. And so there's a mixture, I think, of ways that people are now selling it, which make it very difficult to capture in this region, especially. Okay, are there any questions from anybody so far about any of the projects or about any of the surveys? It's something I want to pose to anybody is if they also themselves have any examples of surveys that they have done, either market surveys or net surveys that they would like to share as examples. So for instance, in the chat, we have Dr. Ram Pratap Singh, who says that your team has actually conducted a systematic study of legal trade of birds in Assam, India. So if you would like to speak a little bit to that, I think we would all love to hear about it. If he's here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
Just a minute, give me a minute. Yeah, so actually one of my PhD student, she has conducted surveys, systematic surveys for over 2 years in Assam in different seasons near, along the, because there are two very important, biodiversity hotspots are present in the form of national park. And we come across with like many difficulties and similarities also what has been presented by, earlier writing. And we come across with more than 100 species. They were actually actively being traded, and most of the trade what we quantified is based on actually a previous reference based. So surprisingly, we did not find many of the species to be displayed in the market during the market surveys. But yes, when you get into the contact like snowballing and all, then obviously you can do that. And they keep on actually changing, and sometimes they also deliver at the place which is far from the markets and all, and the price also varies all the way from few rupees to few thousand rupees. And most important thing what we came across with, because this is a part where we have got the international boundaries with Bangladesh and all. So there was a lot of issues like and some birds like babblers, jungle babblers, they are being hunted like sold in thousands, and like per warbler, de-skinned, you can't identify that way, like in 20 rupee per piece or something like that. So a couple of times we had difficulties faced, because of the obstructions that was created by these peoples, and because they have got very strong network, we were chased, from some spots. Yes, but most important thing is that these markets do not actually display the exact items but the quantum of trade, what is going on behind the scene is enormous. So to assess exactly how much quantity it is being sold, it's quite difficult. But still, we will figure out that, okay, these may name the species that are being sold out, and how the species composition changes from season to season based on the availability of the birds. So we are soon about to publish that paper, and I'm looking forward to collaborate with any of you who are attending this on this aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And if you would like to share that paper with us later, I can always make that available to everybody on the ITTEA website as well after, to make it easier to find. So please get it back in touch with us after that's published.
All right, thank you.
And actually, to address some of that, Claria in the chat has said the visible trade is usually inversely proportionate to enforcement. The more enforcement and checking there is, the less the trade is in the open. If enforcement is high, it goes underground. You need passwords or to know somebody who is trusted to get access. And yeah, I do think that's very true of many of the places that we go to. There's also in a lot of situations where you actually do not see anything being outwardly traded, but you can like request it basically, and then somebody will go get it for you. And in those situations, they're usually for things that are also fairly rare. There are very few people that would buy it, but they would pay a lot of money for it. So there's a mixture, I think, of those types of visibilities as well. Are there any other folks who have done similar studies that they would like to share about, or are they planning any studies that they would like to share that they are doing on this topic? Nobody? So I think that gets at this following question, which I have for everybody, which is, what is the limitation to the ability of different organizations and offices to actually do the work? Because for us, I think one of the main things to think about, this task force is a really good opportunity for everybody to share resources, to make sure we have standardized protocols across the region so that the data are comparable, and then to be able to really do meta-analyses as a whole. And in that situation, we need everybody to be collecting data from all over the place, right? So what is the rate limiting step for everybody? Is it a lack of capacity to do the work? Is it a lack of funding to do the work? Is it a lack of kind of willpower from the offices that you work in to do the work? And if anybody wants to speak to that, I think that would be very important for us to understand where these gaps are, so that also when we cover things next week on the technical side, we have a better understanding of where everybody's at and how we can try to fill those gaps best. All right, so today we spoke a little bit about these market surveys and net surveys, and next week also I will speak a little bit to motivation surveys, which are more on the social science side also, of how we can understand how to limit these types of situations based on why people hunt. So I think we'll cover different kinds of things like that. And if there are variables that come to mind for anybody for why is it that we haven't done these studies, even though it's probably very important, or it could just be your office, like we didn't know this was something that was that important, and we haven't put that much emphasis on it until recently, so we haven't started it. If anybody would like to raise their hand to speak to that, I would love to hear, because I know there's many of you from many different places here, not just from the East Asian Australasian flyway, but also from Europe, from Africa, from the US and everywhere else. Yeah, Dingley.
I just wanted to add a comment, and also as a follow-up to Rong's presentation, which I think is probably the most comprehensive survey of missed nets. And then, of course, next week we have Dan's presentation, which does something on the very similar trajectory. I think based on the early work that was done in the last 6-7 years, especially those conversations prior to 2019. My ex-boss, Evgeny, has mentioned a lot about missed nets being a threat to birds. Obviously, it's not a Thai problem, neither is it a China problem. It's a problem that is quite widespread actually throughout Asia. Another thread of conversation was about the legality and how we can regulate nets, because these days nets are so easily available, and of course there are legitimate reasons as to why we use nets for trapping, for fishing, for example. I think it would be useful if we can synthesize the protocols that have been used by Rong and Dan from both Thailand and China to develop some sort of a best practice guidelines to help other teams to do these sort of some missed net surveys. We are aware that missed nets are also used in Laos for bird hunting, goes without saying. So is it in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Myanmar, in Malaysia, in Philippines. So I think there's quite a lot of value of having such a bit of resource for the conservation community working on mist nets and more broadly the wildlife trade in the region. Yeah, of course, I think we'll need to find time to assemble all that information. But definitely there's a gap and there's a space for this sort of material to be out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. There, the general guideline that BirdLife has up already for the market surveys, for instance, is something that we'll talk about more next week. And I think that is a very good resource for people to also make for net surveys. Clary, you have a question?
Not so much a question, a comment. Thanks very much to all the speakers. It was really very interesting. For those of you who don't know me, I coordinate the MICT, which is the Task Force for the Mediterranean. But I also live in Cyprus, which, and I have worked in Cyprus many years, which is a country in the Mediterranean that has a very huge problem with illegal trapping of songbirds with nets. So I just wanted to make a little comment on the nets. It's not the same as Rongong mentioned, because the nets here are used to trap the birds to sell them as delicacies in illegal, which is illegal, and they're served in restaurants illegally. That's why I wrote about the enforcement, because you know, before this was clearly seen as an illegal activity under the law, and the law was enforced. The birds were served openly. It was even a very special thing to do, to serve the birds. But with increased enforcement, it's gone completely underground. It's very difficult to find birds served these days. But what I wanted to say is that BirdLife Cyprus has a very long-standing program of monitoring nets, and almost more than 20 years now, with a very standardized method of going around doing transects, a bit like you did, only walking transects. And also has come up with the help of the RSPB from the UK with a method of estimating the number of birds caught, so that there is it's one of the best monitored programs around the world, I would say, in terms of illegal activities and birds caught by nets. And they can come up with a very good estimate of the number of birds caught every year illegally. The big difference, I think, with what you mentioned is that here the nets are illegal, they shouldn't be used, and they are used to catch the birds which are eaten, whereas in your case, they're used to prevent the birds. And I think the question there is if there are alternatives, which I'm sure there could be, and if basically these alternatives could be promoted so that this can be made illegal, because otherwise, you know, if people think that this is the only way to do it, even if it doesn't work, they will continue doing it because they're protecting their crop, let's say. So I think there are many methods of monitoring. We know that nets are completely unselective. They catch everything, including all these rare birds, and they die horribly in the sun, exhausted, trying to get away. But the question is finding alternatives, because it seems that they're being used for another purpose there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Clary.
And any if you want to read about the methodology on monitoring the nets, it's widely available. I can share it.
Yeah, if you have a link to that and would like to share that with everybody, that'd be great. Or if you have a file later that you want to put up somewhere, we can also do that. And in the chat right now, there's also, again, a link to Rong's paper that's about her study. If anybody is interested in the INAT project and contributing to it, here's the link for that as well. I encourage people to actually do more citizen science in the region because I know there's not enough scientists. Obviously, we don't have enough hands on deck. There is a BioBlitz that's done every single year as well. There might be other similar topics of interest to people, such as roadkill projects that are in the region that people should definitely check out. INAT's very useful for at least collecting data in that way for Southeast Asia when we don't have enough scientists at hand. All right, okay, so I still open the floor to anybody to, mention anything about these types of, like I mentioned, gaps that they think exist in their organization. If there are things that they want to make sure that we cover next week, that would be great. And Dingley, yes, you have your hand raised.
I have a comment, really, not so much of a question. And this is not something I presented. So the piece of work that we've done comes in 5 different parts, right? We've got the market surveys, we've got the literature and legal surveys, we've got also a bit of online surveillance as well. And that's something that I haven't reported, but it was not something that we planned in a structured way. But by the time we were halfway through the project, it became increasingly clear that there were quite a lot of material online. So I was getting a lot of feedback from our teams in Thailand and Vietnam and in Laos that there's these YouTube site, that YouTube site, Facebook sites. So I regret that we were not able to survey these things in a structured way, partly because we were constrained by time and language barriers. But I think if I had to do this all over again, I would also develop a strong online surveillance component with a focus possibly on YouTube. I think we found YouTube to be quite useful. There was a lot of material. I'm not sure if anybody has actually ever surveyed all the YouTube material on bird hunting in Southeast Asia, of which there's a lot. Because I had a friend of mine who is very fluent in Hmong language. Hmong is a language of Central Laos, Northern Thailand, and Northern Vietnam. And we played around with a few search terms in Hmong language, and we put out like a few hundred websites on hunting. Often they probably represented landscapes in northern Laos or northern Vietnam, and we were able to actually extract a lot of information of birds that were hunted, but many of these were not stuff that would go to the markets. There was a culture of people sharing their hunting experiences on YouTube, for example. I'm not sure if YouTube actually ever monitors this, but this was documented. I called up our Vietnamese colleagues, and they dug the literature in Vietnamese, and we found another 100 YouTube videos in Vietnamese. So that's something that deserves attention. Surveillance of the online material, especially on YouTube in the various Southeast Asian languages.
Yeah, I do agree that not just YouTube, but other video media types of social media like TikTok is also very useful, and Instagram. There are a lot of, not for birds, but for primates, for instance. I know folks who have used that as tools to find out, influencers or other people that have them as pets and be able to capture what the broader population is doing, because it is so difficult to find the primates in the market since people do hide them. So they have actually gone to social media as a better data source because of that. So yeah, I definitely do see that as something that is of great potential data mine. Yeah, Clary.
And just on that, it's very important. In the Mediterranean, we have a huge problem with people showing off in social media, all the illegalities. The important thing there is to have the legal framework that allows you to prosecute based on what is shown on social media. Because in many countries, the law doesn't allow prosecutions or even investigations on the basis of what is on social media. So usually the first step, okay, it's awareness raising, of course, to look at it, but also the first step would be to amend the law to allow you to take steps when you see it online. So that's important element to have as well in your legislation.
Yeah, I definitely do think that that's something that people need to look into. We are across so many different countries that obviously that's going to be something difficult, and that might vary across different jurisdictions as well. Yeah, so Dingley has mentioned these particular languages that could be of particular use in Southeast Asia, especially. I know that at least for Indonesia, we have definitely seen people who post a lot of pictures on Facebook and in Instagram that we have definitely found kind of like hidden Facebook groups and WhatsApp chats where people also share that information. And the WhatsApp ones are obviously more difficult to find and infiltrate because of that. But there is a lot of sharing of hunted animals on that as well. And that's something that we need a more structured way to actually go about going after, because like, you know, like you mentioned, there's no way that you could have known years ago that this was how big it is, and you need to set up how structured it is, because social media changes also very quickly, and how you go about it needs to be very standardized, I think, to really get at what is useful data versus what is ephemeral. So yeah, that's something that I think several groups are working on, at least trying to capture through studies of listings on places like eBay or Etsy, and trying to understand the trends through the sellers and vendors that they do see from that as well. So you have the more formalized platforms as well, not just social media that's being monitored, but how comprehensive those are somewhat lacking right now. And I think that's also a little bit because we need to really push some of the conservation journals to actually prioritize putting that data out there. I know several colleagues who've done studies where they've actually had a great bit of difficulty convincing folks to publish papers that, you know, the editor has said, oh, the scope isn't big enough because it's only in Southeast Asia in one country, or it's only on this particular set of species. And I think that's a very myopic way of viewing what's out there. And we really need to push our colleagues to do better to actually accept these papers, because they're actually filling an extremely important data gap in the region. Okay, are there any other comments or questions from people in the audience?
Susan, would it be nice if we nominated people to say stuff? Because I just did a quick glance at the names there, and there are quite a few knowledgeable colleagues as well. Yeah,
Yes,
I think with colleagues.
I welcome you to call out anybody. I don't feel as comfortable calling them out only because I don't know them as well. But if you are feeling happy to volunteer one of our colleagues to, please go
I'd
ahead.
love to do that. It's part of my job. I see that my colleagues from Thailand, Myanmar are here as well. Phil Round, I think, is in the room.
Yes, he is.
And I think he's done some early work on surveys of bird markets in Bangkok. Phil, if you are hearing us, would you want to weigh in on the status of the bird trapping and mistnet in Thailand, and give a little bit of historical perspective?
He's still muted right now. So
Okay.
we give him a moment and maybe.
Okay.
Are there any of your other colleagues?
Yes.
Oh, there he is. Hello?
There was somebody, I think.
Well,
that's background noise stuff. Are there any other folks you would like to call from Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, and your other colleagues who you work with on your survey that would like to add anything to what you guys have worked on?
I have two of my colleagues from Myanmar here. I'm not sure if they are on the computers, but Thierry and Piole are in the room, and I know they have a very broad understanding of conservation issues in Indo-Burma, including hunting. Thierry and Piole, if you hear me, feel free to share your experiences working on the wildlife trade in Myanmar.
Hello.
Thierry is here. Yep, Thierry.
Yeah, here, Thierry.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for
So,
jumping on. Yeah.
yeah. Our experience in the bird hunting in our country, especially the big season is the hunting is in the wintry seasons. In Myanmar, there are the season, the people who are watching to feed the bush meat, like the water bird species. So in central Myanmar, very a big issue. Yeah, the people who are waiting for these the kinds of the water birds, for the water bird species, for the extra bush meat. So therefore, we have discussed with the government, and Mandalay government, especially the forest department, to stop the bird hunting in that area. So the capacity for the patrolling community guards at the area of wetland area in central Myanmar. So so we formulate the local conservation group, and they are working together, close together with the forest departments. So the Mandalay region in central Myanmar is the high serious of the bird trade in our country. So yeah, just sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, that you mentioned that there is a particular high season. And I think that that's information that in a lot of places in Southeast Asia, it's not known because people haven't done monitoring. So even on a more basic level, before even surveys, people actually need to monitor those populations and expend some resources on that as well. So yeah, that's actually a really good point. That's very necessary. So thank you for sharing that.
I have another question. It's for Fai. I think Fai has given a really comprehensive overview, and this is more coming from my own ignorance. Fai, based on your experiences, are you seeing markets in Thailand in recent years where birds are still being sold for food, or is this today very rare in Thailand? What's your experiences on this? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I think it's a lot less in Thailand, but it's still, especially at the border parts of Thailand, I think they still sells a lot of birds for the bushmeat, for consumption activities, but there are still a lot less. And for the birds that they used to sell for the meat making release, they still exist, but they kind of like, there's a lot of the patrol and more enforcement, so the people not like sell open like in the past day, but they kind of like hide it like at their house, and then they just let people ask them, and then they like bring it to the people who want to buy for them, I think. Yeah,
I see. And
but
based
I
on
think
your
I
go
mean,
for
I
it.
think there's a lot of activities in terms of the huntings for the bushmeat and consumption still, but I have no source because it's kind of like very local scale. You need to know the local people to get access to that data, like which market that they usually sell this kind of birds, thing like that. So yeah.
Yeah, and for your own project, do you plan to expand your work to other parts of Thailand? I know you focus currently on Central Plains. I remember a conversation with Ayuwat about Northern Thailand. Would that be
Yeah.
somewhere on your radar in the future?
I think in the future I might be expand the range of my study, because I think in Thailand there is like big 4 regions that I think people act differently, like northern parts and northeastern parts. My experience, I think they used to catch more birds for the consumption purpose, not just only for like protect the crop, like in the central part of Thailand. And I think this day there's a lot of activities in like YouTube videos and the birds that go and hunt the bird, like specifically for like water hens or and watercocks. Like they have a lot of these activities after the COVID year. Maybe like people have more times to look at for like recreation activities, and they go out and hunt more, which is like all activities is still illegal in Thailand.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks.
So I think it's interesting to like still carry on and conduct more data to do that.
Yeah, as they say, the more you dig, the more you find, and the more worried we become as conservationists. Yeah, thanks for that qualification of the situation in Thailand. I think that was comprehensive, and I think most of us are very impressed by the scale of your survey in central Thailand. I think it's the first time people have looked at this problem at the huge scale. Yeah, Susan. On that note, I probably will need to jump off. I think there's still probably going to be a few questions. So shall I leave you to continue with the discussions? And thanks to Fai and Thierry for some really great examples from Myanmar and Thailand, 2 of the mega diverse countries in our region. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ning Li. We'll finish up with a couple more questions, and then I'll catch up with you later and see you on Monday.
Cheers. Cool. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. And actually, I had a follow-up question to what you mentioned with those 4 regions. Are those divisions primarily based on divisions in the biodiversity that's available there, or divisions in what people are using the birds for? Like, is it because you think that it's just based on just locality wise, the geographic distance makes it so that it's 4 very separate regions?
I think it's both. It's kind of like geography and the biodiversity. I mean, there's a lot more lack food resource in northeastern part and northern part compared to like southern, which is like very close to the sea, and they can get alternative food. It's kind of, I think.
Yeah, because I also wonder, because for some other countries where, you know, there's no local consumption, but they primarily hunt because they have middlemen that come in from other countries or other places that are feeding into a different market and different demand, that it increases the level of illegal take of all kinds of wildlife. So, you know, I think that a good example, for instance, even is with higher priority animals like elephants. You know, they get hunted in Southeast Asia and then they get transported over to Hong Kong and to China. So I think if there is any situation like that also in any of the places that you're working on or suspect there might be, because I do want to understand, I think, the commodity chain also in general, for if it's only local consumption or if it's being transported elsewhere to fill in that demand.
Yeah. I can see your question, but I don't know how to answer though.
But we don't know, right? I think it's possible just this, we don't know right now.
Yeah, I don't know right now, but I think I have a case to share. Like, I have talked with the local farmers, and they said like there's a people from elsewhere to come to their fields and catch the whistling duck to sell, like to import from that area, to export from that area to like other parts of the country, which I'm not sure how we can rely on that information, but I think it's interesting, like why did they need to catch the whistling ducks at that particular area to sell elsewhere, which I kind of like don't know what is the reason for now.
Yeah, I do think that's a really interesting line of inquiry as well. If you actually get a chance to talk to anybody who knows if there are middlemen that are also contributing to that. I work on bats, and this is very common, where people will come to places where there are bat roosts, where they are found in abundance, and then we'll bring them to other places, right? And so this transport is very common for that particular trade. And even for seafood. I was once in the middle of absolutely nowhere in Maluku in Indonesia, and I was at a village in literally the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. And these lovely people who we were working with on bats suddenly told me, oh, our fishing village actually sends all of these to Hong Kong. And they all knew the names of them in Cantonese. And I was very surprised, because I did not expect to hear Cantonese in the middle of nowhere in Indonesia. So like there is clearly a commodity chain that wasn't known by other people, and they pay a lot of money in some cases for these places that are very key source areas that nobody else knows about. So I wonder if you have ran across any of that, because I think that's a really interesting part of this commodity chain that's very poorly known also in the region, at least for especially migratory birds. And I think for migratory birds, that's also very important when we consider different landscapes and habitats and geographies that they're distributed in, since they are vulnerable in very different ways compared to more endemic species. So yeah, that would be really cool to see if you find more of that later on. Okay, so Clary, yes, I will share the links to any of the papers mentioned in the presentations later on. So don't worry about that. I will send out something after both of the workshops with everything in one place. And also we will have a link on the ITTEA website that will be for this particular workshop to have all the resources, just to put them all in one place. It makes it easier for everybody to access later on. And since we're almost at the end, I would just like to once again ask one last time if there are any questions from anybody in the audience or any comments that people would like to make before we close out for today. If there's nothing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, well, I thank you everybody again for all the speakers and the discussion, everybody who's contributed. I greatly appreciate that you all came here. And again, we will have the second session on Monday, August 7th. It starts at the same time. It uses the same link, but I will send another reminder before the event itself again. And if anybody wants to get in contact with any of us who were speaking today, please feel free to reach out to me and, just ask me for the information from whoever it is that you want to talk to. I did also quickly make a slide with all our emails, so if you want to just copy that down. So you should see my second screen. So yeah, those are all of our emails for anybody that needs to find any of us. And I will send out a more comprehensive list of everything else afterwards. If there are no more questions, then I would like to close out for today. We will be speaking more to the technical side of things again next week. And thanks again. I will see all of you later next week then. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.